Good morning, folks. It's Saturday morning, 10:21 my time here in the central United States. So it's 11:21 out east. And of course, what would that be? 8:21 out on the West Coast. And in the mountains and the desert in between, you're somewhere else. So I just want to say good Saturday morning on the Memorial Weekend. And if you happen to be here and catching this live, this is just a little impromptu thing I wanted to do. Hey, good morning, Jason. Good to see you, brother. And I wanted to do a little something just in honor of Memorial Day, but a little different than you might think. It's based on an old article that I wrote. And so I've got the script of it up here on my screen rather than just going extemporaneously off the top of my head. But as I do with everything, even in the reading of my books, I'll probably ad lib a lot through. And the first thing I wanted to get across, because my kids asked me this question. I have a 9-year-old son who's almost 10, and a 7-year-old daughter, and a 4-year-old daughter that are still at home with me. And I took them to school yesterday, and they said, "What's Memorial Day?" And I know my older son knew a little bit more about it. So I explained to them as simply as I could. Memorial Day is when we remember those who died in service to our country. And at the same time, I said we can remember other people who've passed on as well in our lives. And hey, Kay, how you doing? And so I said the difference is Veterans Day, we honor our veterans. Memorial Day, we honor our veterans and our loved ones who were in the military, who died giving service to our country. And so that's what Memorial Weekend's all about. Although it's become a thing where it's just a day off on a Monday and we get a long weekend, we hope for good weather so we can have a picnic or go tubing down the river or do something and just have time work in the yard, whatever we want to do. And that's really what it's become for most Americans. There are very few of us, I think, that go out and participate in ceremonies. Although I was once part of a military reenacting group where we would go out on Memorial Weekend. We reenacted the Highland Scots who were part of the British Army during the French and Indian War. So we were redcoats with kilts and our muskets and our swords. And we would go out on Memorial Day to different venues. Sometimes up to Fort Snelling we would go just to see what they would reenact up there outside of Minneapolis. And so we've always participated in one way or the other. But it came to my mind to express some things because of current politics. I consider myself a conservative. However, I am a small C conservative, believe it or not, with a libertarian bent. And I'm also, I guess you could say I'm a small L libertarian as well. But I'm a constitutionalist. I'm an originalist. I like what the Constitution says. I believe what the Constitution says. And I support what the founders said about the Constitution. And Kay, yes, you live near Lexington, Massachusetts. I've been there one time when I got out of the Marine Corps way back, and we're talking 35 years ago. I went to with one of my old drill instructors, believe it or not. He and I became pretty good friends. And he said, "Come on out to Boston." He says, where he lived. He says, "See all the historical shit and all of that," is what he said to me. So I flew out and I spent a weekend out there, and we went up to Lexington, Concord, where the shot heard around the world, and saw the historical stuff. So it was a lot of fun. And I'd like to take my kids back there. As many of you know who follow me, we went to my daughter's wedding in South Carolina a couple of weekends ago. And then we took the slow drive back with the little kids and saw a bunch of historical things in Charleston and on the way home. So I love history. I love traveling, love road trips for that. So anyway, back to this article I wrote was, probably 9 or 10 years ago. And I was sifting through my politics a bit. Do I want to be one of the things that drove me out of the evangelical church was when I would hear things like somebody preaching and saying, "You've got to tell the world that this is what we believe as Baptists." And I said, well, wait a minute. God isn't going to ask anybody if they're a Baptist. He's going to ask other questions. And same thing with politics. I had a big problem with just being a Republican or a GOP or a conservative. And I said, I believe more than that. There's more to it than that. And I cross over in many different areas. And so I wrote this little article that was kind of exploring it about 10 years ago. And of course, I've evolved my belief system politically even since then. And I'm a conservative, small c, a libertarian, small c. I'm a patriot, son of a patriot, capital P. I believe in my country. I believe in my Constitution. I believe it was a stroke of genius in humanity and probably one of the finest documents ever written for governing purposes. And it's still relevant today. The only thing that makes it irrelevant are people who want to, so used to their, getting on their iPhones and their pads and changing everything willy-nilly, that now they want the Constitution changed because, we think a little differently. And you don't do that. This is why the founders made it incredibly difficult to amend the Constitution. We'll talk about that someday and go through that. But my political beliefs, I am a constitutionalist. I am originalist in the intent of the Constitution. I don't think it's rocket science to figure out what the original intent of the Constitution was. Although we like to convolute it and confuse it a lot nowadays. So being that, I started looking more to calling myself a Jeffersonian liberal. I respected the work of Thomas Jefferson, and I became something that was, I guess, Jeffersonian liberalism is uber conservative. But I'm not uber conservative either. So I'm a constitutionalist with Jeffersonian leanings and constitutional originalist foundation with a conservative overcoating of candy and a libertarian bent. So that's what you could call me. I have people that say, oh, well, you're just a Republican. I said, I'm not a Republican, and I'm certainly not a Democrat. And so that's what I am. And I'm hailing to this article I wrote some time ago, like I said, about 10 years ago, and I'm going to go start with this. I'm going to read from it, but I'm going to comment on it as well. So again, happy Memorial Day weekend, Saturday morning. Let's dig into this just a little bit and think about why we celebrate Memorial Day. Think of where we stand on issues. I am a hashtag facts over feeling, hashtag substance over symbolism kind of guy. Ronald Reagan was the very first president I helped elect to office, and twice, as a matter of fact, much to the chagrin of my Minnesota DFL, which is Democratic Farm Labor Relations, and my dyed-in-the-wool liberal communist grandfather. Yeah, he was a communist. He was a union organizer in the 50s and the 60s and in Ohio, and very much, I'd say, a living, breathing, believing socialist and communist. He would travel the world with a backpack and visit and meet people all over the world. This is the kind of guy he was. Although he would never live in a communist system, but that's what he was. I, on the other hand, was the token black sheep of the family. I was the young Turk conservative. Call me the Alex Keaton of my family. You remember Alex Keaton? Michael J. Fox created that character in Family Ties in was it the 70s or the 80s? I think it was the 80s because it was Reagan era. I was the tie-wearing, church-going Reagan revolutionary in my family of liberal Democrats and communists. For me, conservatism was the political manifesto of God. And as a Bible-thumping, ministry-bound seminarian in the early 80s, I laced my speech and my actions with the finer points of Reaganomics, and I lauded the presidential pink slipping of striking air traffic controllers. Are any of you old enough to remember that when that happened? The 1980s was most definitely the age of conservatism, of Reagan conservatism, with its military buildup that bolstered the Reagan version of Roosevelt's walk softly but carry a big stick philosophy, and the unfettered growth of corporate America, who proved to me, Reagan, who proved to me over and over again that greed in its proper perspective was indeed good. I'm sorry, Reagan didn't teach me that. The business did. That was the days of Gordon Gekko, if you remember that fictional character. Greed is good, but it's only good if you're building something. And those were the days. Life was good for me. And as seen through my youth colored glasses, there were only better days ahead, filled with a bright future for my country, as long, that is, as Reagan could get around that pesky constitutional prohibition on his running for a third, maybe even fourth term, age notwithstanding. I mean, that's the way we thought back then. That's the way we believed in my circle of conservatism. One thing that's been seared into my mind over the years is that the older I get, and I'm older even now, I'm 10 years old, I'm pushing 60, the less I know for sure. As I like to say, the more shit I know, the more I know I don't know shit. When one begins to question entrenched beliefs, it rarely comes on the epiphanous lightning bolt of a decisive moment in time. It rather rides that slow ox cart of westward bound pioneers who watched the familiar landscape gradually transform from the Appalachian forests to the prairies and the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains beyond. My landscape has changed. While I held true to the Reagan conservatism of my youth, and still do in very many ways, even now, I found myself combating the hard line of conservatives, just as in the church, where I held to a lot of the doctrine and the dogma, but had a real problem with Christians. But I held to the hard line of combating the hard line of conservatives who seemed to evolve into a form that I found was no longer representative of what I believed as a human being. There were certain things that I had problems with. And I really, folks, it took me 10 years, even since I wrote this article, to sift through some of that and decide what was conservative compassion, or compassionate conservatism, as they called it. What did I really stand for when I said I was a conservative? I was a hard line on certain issues, but a soft line on other issues. I was a fiscal conservative, yet liberal in my thinking about people. So I struggled with these things, and there it is. Oh, there it is. Human beingism. I have morphed from being a political ideologue into being more or less a humanist. And I use the small h deliberately, as to not be confused with the philosophical mindset of humanism. I'm not a humanist in that sense. Though disagreeing vehemently with his politics, I remember the words of my own grandfather, who told me a very long time ago, his eyes filling with genuine tears, that he could no longer love a country that could let children and poor people suffer, while he and others who had means simply lived as though they didn't exist. And the poor and downtrodden in life are invisible, he postulated to me. At that time, I brushed him off as spewing socialistic jargon, but his words made great impact on my deeper thinking. Despite the years it took for me to come to that realization, I think his words molded my psyche more than I would have admitted I had been cognizant of at the time. I have as you all know, a great love of history. And one of my areas of personal study and research has been the 19th century expansion into the American West. More recognizable in the conservative mindset, or people's mindset in general, as the manifest destiny, an eminent domain over a conquered people here on the continental America, North America. Though a man of Welsh Scot descent, which is what I am, I've always been intrigued with Native American studies. My own blonde-haired, blue-eyed children are an eighth, not very much, but a hell of a lot more than Elizabeth Warren. They're an eighth Oneida, one of the tribes of the Six Nations, through their mother, my ex-wife. And I felt it was good for them to grow up knowing about all the elemental aspects of their heritage. I now this is something I'll tell you. It's been over romanticized. Rocky Stucci, I just saw you pop up. He says, Roberts, Stucci, good to see you, brother. And again, to everybody who's joining, who's come in, I'm hailing off of an old article of mine and doing a little ad-libbing at the same time. Brother, the PGA people are not my kind of people, says Rocky. The dark side of the business is you have to associate with the cult of society, club of society. I get it. So, Rocky, are you not bringing home a green sport coat? Rocky is stuck, if you will, while he's out doing this conservative event, doing the PGA. And nope, he's not coming home with a green PGA jacket. Just pull out your flask and drink while they're golfing. And clap, Rocky. When somebody tees off, just go, yeah, yeah. That's the way you do. These are golf claps. You want to do a Rocky Stucci clap. Yeah, hey, hell yeah. Fuck yeah, that was a great swing. Whatever you call it. So miss you, brother, too. Wish I was there. So, folks, let me continue on here that my study of Native American culture and history really opened my eyes to the way we would see one thing one way through history and through the way we believed politically, but it was a very different perspective from the other side of things. I get it. I get all the arguments. Oh, there were a conquered people. We came in, we expanded the United States. We had manifest destiny. We said, we're going to take what is we claim as ours, and we're going to drive you out. We're stronger than you. We're better than you. And so we're going to take over. We're going to build something spectacular. Well, all you do is ride ponies in the grass and worship all kinds of gods when there's only one God. And, this is the way we thought in the 19th century and earlier. Some people still think that way today. And so I had a real problem with that. And I wanted to study that and find out more about it. And the more I studied, the more it ripped my heart out. Now, yes, he was a socialist of sorts. He was a leftist. But the author D. Brown wrote an amazing book that you all need to pick up and read. It was called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. If you haven't seen that book or read that book, you need to. It gives you may not agree with what you know is the foundational political bent of the author, but you can take that out of your mind because he really doesn't speak to politics. He speaks to history, the history of his own people. And what we saw as the conquering, the expansion into the American West, the Native Americans who lived there saw it as the destruction of their culture. And it really was. And I have many times likened the westward expansion in the United States and the eradication of the tribal system of Native Americans and all their different tribes to like the Highland clearances in the 1700s after the Battle of Culloden Moor, where the English general, what's his name? It's slipping my mind. It's right on the tip of my tongue. Cumberland marched in, and under Bonnie Prince Charlie and all the amalgamated clans who fought against him, destroyed the clan system forever. They wiped it out forever. And no longer a system of governance in the Highlands of Scotland after that battle in 1746. Was it 46? I believe so. And to this day, that doesn't exist anymore. There's a remnant of it, and there is a romanticized version of it. And you can now wear the kilt in your Scottish clans and so on. But after that, the king put out an edict to clear the Highlands, and they cleared the Highlands of the Scottish clans. And the only way they were able to reestablish some form of government on their own was the King of England said, "Oh, look at all these swarthy Highlanders we've driven out of the Highlands. Such a waste of humanity." He says, and conscribe them into the military. And they found a way. They offered this is why you have the clans that are represented in the British Army, the 42nd Royal Highlanders, the Gordon Highlanders, all these different Highland clans that are part of the British service and still active today. This was the way that the clan chieftain could incorporate whatever he had left monetarily and conscribe soldiers from his clan. And they were able to, in a way, almost govern themselves within the structure of the British Army in the late 18th century. And so it was very interesting period of time. But what happened in the American West with the expansion at around the same time period was we wiped out the clan or tribal structure of government and cleared them off their lands. And some of that stuff still goes on today. But anyway, all of that is my rabbit trail to say this is why I found I wanted to learn more. And the more I learned, the more I found I was disgusted with what happened. That does not mean, by the way, I'm going to take my property and give it back to the tribe that was here 150 years ago. Those were different times. We're here now. There's not much you can do about it. It's our history. So how do you reconcile history with the present? Here's a good point on that exactly. I remember an argument that ensued in the mid-1990s when I was married to my ex-wife between my in-law relatives and me while sitting around the Thanksgiving table. The heated discussion arose when my brother-in-laws, all avid anglers, were expressing their vehemence that treaty rights in Minnesota with the Mille Lacs Band of the Ojibwe needed to be rescinded. Rocky, you'll remember this. Those of you who've lived in this area or other areas that have experienced some of this, you'll understand that in current day, we were trying to rescind the treaty rights from the 1800s. They were supporting a new legislation that would eliminate 19th century tribal fishing rights on Lake Mille Lacs. Their argument was that the Ojibwe were taking far too many fish, leaving none for the anglers and the tourism-driven summer vacationers and all the lodges up north around the lake there. And the vacationers. Well, believe me when I tell you that the shit hit the fan when I reminded my fisherman brothers-in-law that the treaty with the Ojibwe included the phrase, in perpetuity. In perpetuity. Do you know what that means? It means that the terms of the treaty would be, in essence, forever. The business of summer tourism and fishing had suddenly become more important than the United States and the state of Minnesota upholding its end of the treaty, rendering the words in perpetuity null and void as soon as economics came into the mix. The conservatism of my in-law family members outweighed the efficacy of the contract made with the Ojibwe. They were ready to wage a new war on the Native American peoples of central Minnesota. And this is all because of fishing. Now, by the way, the Ojibwe had the right to spearfish up on that lake. And what they would do is go take their limit every day. And they sold in their markets. They fed their reservation. All of this stuff. And yet the fishermen had a problem with it because it was injuring the tourism trade up in Lake Mille Lacs. So they kept trying to find ways to get around the in perpetuity phrase. One of them, of course, was to state that, well, no Ojibwe living there today is full-blooded anymore, and these treaties were written to full-blooded peoples. And I had a huge problem with that when I saw some of that. And Jason, you're right. Some of them are a little uppity. Oh, wait, you're talking about Gulf management. Yeah, I get your point. So money doesn't buy character. You're absolutely right, Rocky, and that crosses over into many different areas. So this scenario has been reenacted time and time again with the native peoples of America, from gold in the Dakotas to uranium in New Mexico. My conservatism would tend to support the notion that this is the new age and money should walk while bullshit should walk. Money should talk while bullshit should walk, letting economics and greed determine the civility, the heart, and the humanity of the situation. The age old cliche of the black caped, top hatted land developer tying the hapless, helpless farmer's daughter to the railroad tracks was reliving itself in different forms all around me. And while I supported the conservative belief that money, development, industry, and greed should have dominion over contracts, natural resources, and common human decency, I felt that my humanity was being compromised. And it put me into a little bit of a personal internal struggle. I remember working for a big commercial printing house in Lynchburg, Virginia, back in the early 1980s. I was a fresh-faced kid working on my theological education and continuing to construct my conservative views. One of the biggest clients we serviced from our shop was Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority, right there in Lynchburg, Virginia. We worked with Liberty University, which was his school, the Old Time Gospel Hour, which was his evangelical television show, and of course the political branch that he became the religious figurehead of, the Moral Majority, headquartered right there in Lynchburg, Virginia. This was for me, a Reagan conservative, like living in heaven's backyard. I was doing my craft as an artist and a designer, and I was working for a company that worked for a huge conservative outfit like that politically. One morning, I was picking up some paperwork at the offices of the Moral Majority, and I had to make a quick stop in the men's room. Now, I've told this story before. I think Rocky knows this story. While I was conducting my brief business in front of the urinal, a member of the Moral Majority's senior staff, and I know his name, I'm not going to mention him now. It's not important. It wasn't Jerry Falwell. It was one of the staff of people that he had running the Moral Majority, which I thought were a bunch of crappy losers. I didn't like any one of them. I thought they were all shitheads. But that aside, and that's from a 22-year-old's perspective, he entered the lavatory, and I recognized him, and he'd seen me around as well. And we did the polite chit-chat that takes place between guys standing at public urinals when he simply blurted out how much he hated homosexuals. And I got to tell you, folks, I thought that was really odd. He even paraphrased the words of Indian-hating General Sheridan by shouting out, "The only good faggot is a dead faggot." And here we are. We didn't encounter each other for a whole 30 seconds. Hey, good morning. How you doing? And there we are standing in front of our urinals, and he blurts this out. Thinking, what? Why is he doing this? And I was in stunned silence. I was mortified that a senior member of the Moral Majority's staff was decrying gays while we both stood holding our respective penises in our respective hands in front of our respective urinals. All I could mumble out at the moment, and I wasn't very vociferously outspoken back in those days. I was still formulating my confidence. I said, I kind of see the love of Jesus as inconsistent with lynching homosexuals. He spent the next several minutes berating my words and telling me what a true conservative ought to believe on the matter. And that incident was frankly one of the earliest remembrances for me of a conservative that aligned itself with God, yet so contradicted what I considered to be, in my understanding, the love of God. This began my trek down the path of confusion. If conservatism was good, how could it hold to ideals that seemingly contradicted goodness? And this defines the internal struggle I'm engaged in, even to this day, or 10 years ago when I wrote this. Because now, mind you, I've come to some good terms with that. I don't think it's conservatism is equal to being discompassionate. But at the time, I was seeing conservatism as people who stood for things that just seemed to not fit with what I understood to be the love of God, yet while claiming that they were the moral majority, and the religious right, the religious conscience of our country. Now, perhaps I'm being a little harsh with my conservative brothers and sisters. I still hold to many certain conservative ideals. I'm a conservative, but I've begun to temper those ideals with more heart and humanity, at least to a greater extent than I did before I started understanding how much more important those things were. And this has led me to an innate confusion, the colliding of two internal trains heading toward each other on the same set of tracks. I understand and adhere to conservative ideals of personal responsibility, learning how to fish rather than being handed a free fish. I believe that all men are created equal, and that they're all endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not the guarantee of fairness. Constitution never said you're going to feel good all the time. But I know in my heart of hearts that the government that rules least is the government that rules best. And that smartest government, non-invasive taxation, the right to bear arms, and being a nation of law is essential to the continued life of the United States of America. Still today, those principles do not change. But where I started to drift from the mainline conservative agenda, it seemed, was when I see human beings falling through the cracks of the decking of American conservatism. You can't eat idealism. Smaller government never prevented a needy family's electricity from being shut off for inability to pay. Sure, maybe in the long run, our system of free enterprise can establish a better future for everyone. But what do people do while conservatives are attempting to build their own version of a utopia that is not the liberal, progressive, hands in everybody else's pockets except their own form of governing? Somewhere in the mix, we as conservatives, and I believe this, we've lost touch with our humanity. We promulgate great things that can happen down the road, but have no fail-safes for the people caught in the mix of political rivalry. If you notice, things like even the abortion issue, which I hate talking about, it's a political football. It's not really there to help anybody. It's there to create laws and control in either direction. And I think there are people caught in the middle of a lot of the arguing. And this is why, I've always believed that congressional gridlock is a damned good thing. The slower the government moves, the better for anyone with a purse or a wallet. But in the midst of all the fighting and political maneuvering, the people lose. Now, I'm speaking in some generalities here, but I want you to think about this, because there are so many people caught in the middle that some of them don't even know what they believe about politics, but they're stuck trying to make sure they keep the lights on, trying to make sure they have food on the table, trying to make sure they never have to make an emergency room run because it's going to cost them everything they made last month. This is where people are stuck. And where do these people go? I'm not talking about religion or moral majorities, but rather about placing humanity above politics. We are to be good stewards of our planet and its inhabitants. The new Green Deal is a bunch of bullshit, by the way. That's not being a good steward. That's being stupid. We need to downsize government while at the same time finding ways to not let people fall through the cracks. We have to strive at all times to uphold and defend the Constitution in its original intent, which, like I said earlier, ain't rocket science. The only way you argue about original intent is when you're really striving to make it mean something that you want it to mean rather than what it was written to mean. And in the living recognition of life, we need to be that as conservatives, as humanitarian conservatives, as people who live by common sense. We need to be living recognition of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not happiness. I mean, you notice, that's a good point here. Kind of alluded to this earlier. Constitution, you notice, doesn't guarantee happiness. And everybody gets all up in arms because I'm not happy with the Constitution. I think we should change it. Well, the Constitution only guarantees you life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, an atmosphere that allows you to pursue your personal happiness, not leave people behind, but help create opportunity. And in the meantime, help those who can't help themselves. I think that's what a true conservative is, that has humanity at the core. I find myself from time to time wondering how Ronald Reagan would handle current foreign or domestic governmental crises. WWRD, what would Reagan do? And I wrote this article, by the way, in the first couple of years of Obama's administration. But as I grow older, I find myself internalizing things and letting them affect me on a much more personal level. So the real question I need to ask is not how my party or its representatives should be handling things in my place as my representatives, but how I, as a citizen of this great country and a free-thinking individual possessing personal freedom and God-given liberty, how do I live and act like a human being? Conservatives and liberals, be damned. And this is the way I think. And I thought that this was an appropriate message for this Memorial Weekend. Remember those who gave their lives defending this country. Some might ask, what about military actions we didn't agree with, or military who died senselessly in a war where we shouldn't be involved? That doesn't matter a fucking little bit, folks, because what those people did was they stood in the gap. They put their lives on the line for our country, for you. You weren't there, unless you were a veteran too. You weren't there. They were there for you. What was the famous Orwell line? And I don't remember it. It just popped into my head. Rough men stand ready at night so you can sleep peacefully in your beds. I paraphrased it there. And so this is what we need to be as a people, as citizens. I look at the immigration problem down on the southern border. And you know what? I feel for some of those people that are trying to get in. I get it. Some of them want to be here. And we would love to offer an open door to those people. But there is so much abuse that you also have to have law. You have to have law. You can't just fling the doors open wide and say, hey, everybody, come on in. Yeah, go wherever you want. You can't do that. There has to be law in place. There has to be conservatism, I think, over liberalism, even though a lot of the liberals who are against the wall today are people who supported it when Obama suggested it. So there you go. And that's generally speaking. So you know what? There are a lot of things going on in this country that I think citizens need to take a more conservative stance on. But at the same time, we need to rule from not the heart, but let the heart control our actions. I'm not saying take over our responsibilities. Like, it's like this. If my kid needs some punishment or discipline, I love my child. I don't want to see them cry. I don't want to see them hurt. But if I withhold judgment, if I withhold discipline, I'm going to raise a creature that is abominable to our society. So I incorporate discipline. When a parent says, we just said this the other day, when a parent says to a child, this is going to hurt me more than it does you, we're being very honest. I don't like punishing my children, but I love the outcome of punishing my children. They learn to discipline themselves. They learn responsibility. So there is love and compassion mixed with personal responsibility, mixed with common fucking sense. And as Rocky and I have always said, we're never smarter than common sense. And you're right, Ron. It's all a political game out there. So it's opening your eyes, being woke. I hate that term. On a spiritual level, I love the idea of the being awake. Now we've shortened that to be, it's got to be modern. You got to be woke. You gotta know what's going on. You got to open your eyes, take off the blinders, open the third eye of politics if you need to. and look at things and say, wait a minute, this is all a political fucking game. Shut up. Hashtag shut up, aka Rocky Stucci. So, folks, there's my little message to you of love, compassion, humanity, conservatism versus liberalism on this great holiday, Memorial Day weekend. It's gorgeous here, by the way. I hope it's gorgeous where you are and you can celebrate and have a fun weekend. It's meant to take time off, but don't forget to remember those who put their life and lost their lives on the line for you. And those who, I got to put this plug in. I'm not plugging any particular organization, but I know, and I've got a good friend, a couple of them, that are PTSD from their time in the service, recent years. You got to remember them as well. They have not died and passed on, but they've died inside a little bit. And I'm maybe contriving it a bit. On Memorial Day, think of the veterans as well that gave everything they have and are left as living shells in our society. Put yourself out for them. Don't let them fall through the cracks. So have a happy Memorial Day. Have a great day today. This has been fun connecting with you, and I will see you again soon.